Good afternoon and welcome back to the workbench, where today I'm just going to put together a little circuit board that I etched recently. And this is a pretty simple thing, nothing too complicated, just a bunch of infrared LEDs and some resistors for them. I'm just going to make myself a little sort of night vision light that I wanted to use. And basically, because of the circuit board I had lying around was only this size, I had to cram the design basically onto this because I didn't have anything bigger at the time, and so to get that down to that size I had to use some surface mount resistors, and I had originally intended to use through hole ones because that would have been easier, but I decided, well, I have a bunch of surface mount ones and that was all that fit, so I designed the design to use those, although I am using standard 5mm LEDs, just cheap ones off eBay, a pack of 100, couple of dollars. Can't remember exactly the price, but not very much. So that's pretty good. And I just wanted to do a quick video about soldering surface mount components. Basically, I think I have done this in a previous video repairing a Dell monitor, but I kind of wanted to just give a video specifically about that. So because basically myself, I originally was quite wary of surface mount stuff, and I never liked the idea of it, and I thought it was terrible. And then actually, when it came time for me to actually use them and start soldering them, and because I had to repair stuff that had surface mount parts, or there were parts I had that were only in surface mount packages, then I've actually realized when I finally tried it out that it's actually a lot less annoying than I thought. Okay, so the resistors I'm soldering today here are 2012, which is metric size, so these are 0804 in imperial, so they're fairly small but not hugely small. I'd say if you are starting out with surface mount stuff and you can choose what you're doing, then 1206 imperial is a good start, or bigger, but these are fairly easy with standard tools as well. So I'm going to be doing some of those, quite a few of them actually. And to do that, these are really the only surface mount parts on this board. All the LEDs are through hole, as you can see. That's all the holes there. So just these resistors here. And to do that, it's pretty simple. You just need some tweezers. These fine pointed ones. These come down to a sort of needle point almost, so these are quite good. I got these from Jaycar, about $15. They're not super high quality, but they definitely are very fine and work pretty well. You need also some solder, obviously. You can use any kind of solder you like, lead-free or not. But this particular one is 0.3mm. This is what I prefer to use. This, incidentally, is the only decent solder I've found on eBay. This is definitely a higher price than all the rest, and it's the only one that I've seen has a consistent quality. It isn't 60/40 as it does claim on the listing, and possibly says on here, I'm not sure, or maybe doesn't, but they claim it to be 60/40. It's not. It's some sort of either lead-free imitation or some sort of bastardized version of 60/40, but in any case, it still works fairly well for eBay solder, and it's probably the cheapest way to get something like 0.3 or 0.4mm. You can also use the leaded stuff I've got here, some old 60/40. It's 0.45mm. This is also pretty good, but again, it's obviously bigger than the 0.3, so it's a little bit, well, I'm not going to say difficult, but it is easier to do this with the smaller solder. So 0.3 is a pretty good start. I've found, I think the trick really with surface mount stuff is you definitely need a lot less solder than you may imagine, and you need a lot more flux than you would imagine. So to that end, you also need a flux pen. So I've got some of this. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as it's not highly acidic. Something like this one here is quite acidic. If you do use something like this, you definitely need to clean it afterwards, or you will get pretty obvious corrosion on your board afterwards. Now, this one is just a standard RMA flux. It says on here, yeah, RMA flux. So this is very similar to the flux that's already in the solder, so no problems there. You can leave that on, or you can clean it off. I usually clean it off, but you don't have to. It's no clean, just like this stuff. It's not really an issue. You also need some solder wick. Now that might seem a bit odd, but truth is, like the circuit board, for example, the pads you've got here. Let's see if I can get a close up on these. You will notice that they're not entirely flat. There is sort of some bumps on them. The pads there in the corner do have domed solder on where I've tinned the board, and this will also be the case most likely if you're reworking something else. If you've just desoldered a component you want to replace, it'll most likely will have left some of the original solder on the pads, so you definitely need to flatten that before you attempt to solder something like this on, because it really won't work if the pads aren't basically perfectly flat. So you need to remove the original solder with the wick. I have to cut this bit off because it's got solder there, but anyway, so you need to do that first. And of course you need a soldering iron, and to that end I've just got my standard one. This is chisel tip, 2.8mm I think. You don't actually need anything super tiny, as I've actually found myself. This will work fine for these resistors, 0804, as I said, but for smaller ones it may be desirable to use a smaller tip. But in this case, for this or bigger, this chisel tip standard size is perfectly acceptable. Basically it's less about the size of the tip and more about the amount of solder, and that's what I've found mostly to be the issue. Too much solder is what really gives the headache in surface mount stuff, and also not enough flux. Okay, so here's a close-up of the pads that I'm working on, and you can see they're quite sort of bumpy from the solder on them, so I need to flatten that out. So I'm going to put the some flux on here, just to make life a bit easier. And then I can get my wick, and I can just get those nice and flat. Also bearing in mind that trace that I'm running between the pads also has to be nice and flat to accommodate the resistor over the top of it. There we go. You can see now that the pads look a lot nicer than they just did. So now I can grab my resistor. Now if I just check my board diagram so I actually figure out what value I need to put in that particular point. So there's our resistor here, and the tweezers, 15 ohms. But I'm going to put some extra flux on here first. So more flux first. And then place the resistor on the pads. Get it lined up. And then we bring the hot iron in, and just holding the resistor in place, just bring the iron in, reflow the solder there. So now it's just tacked on the board. You can see now it doesn't move. It's tacked on that end there. And this end is still free, but that's okay. So now we add more flux, and this is where we bring the actual solder in. The tinning on the board already did the job that we had there. Now we bring the actual solder in, noticing how the thin solder is quite good. We get that on the other side that we tacked, and then we just bring the iron in and heat that pad till it reflows. Looks good. And now we can add some more flux and do the other side again. So lie the solder next to the joint there, bring the heat in, and we're soldered. So it is pretty simple, really. So I'll do that again for the next pads over here. It's basically the same procedure. So we wick the pads till they're flat. Make sure that's good. We place the next resistor here. There we go. So bring the... well, hang on a second. Need some more flux. Hold it in place. From the tacking, and in fact there was enough solder on my iron that it's actually done that side perfectly already, so there we go. Don't have to worry about that. Let's do the other side now. Same deal, really. Oops. And that's done. It's just so you can see those are soldered pretty well. It's actually probably a bit too much solder on there, but you know, for a little DIY board it's not too bad. The main points are just making sure you have a lot of flux. So lots of flux, not too much solder, and just take your time and be patient, and works out pretty well. So there we go. I'll just do the rest of these off camera and then I'll come back and finish. Because my battery's running out anyway. So there we go. Hopefully that shows you that it's actually fairly easy to solder surface mount components, even with a standard soldering iron and pretty basic tools. You only really need some extra flux and a decent pair of tweezers and some fine solder. Obviously with anything below 0804, like 0603, 0402, that kind of is getting into tricky territory there, and definitely for the smaller parts you definitely need a smaller tip. But yeah, with 0804, 0805, I feel I can always never remember which one it is. I think it's 0804. But yeah, 804, whatever, 1206 and higher, you can use a standard iron just fine. Anyway, there we go. So I finished installing all the resistors and I've installed all the LEDs, so you can see how that's come out pretty well. And interestingly though, interesting note, as I mentioned in the previous video about the drill bits of disappointment, yeah, these LEDs, these cheap LEDs from China, infrared LEDs, they are infrared and they do work, but there was a little surprise that obviously, you know, like I said, there's always something, well, I say something wrong, but there's always some sort of hidden surprise, something not quite right. These have what appear to be aluminium leads, so they are tougher to cut and more likely to blunt your side cutters, which is kind of annoying. I mean, in terms of the actual leads themselves, they work perfectly fine, and you know, it's not really going to be an issue. But yeah, just something to note about that. They've obviously used that instead of copper to save cost, which is why these are cheaper than everywhere else. Yeah, just that sort of thing you got to watch out for. Also, there was only about forget now, 99 or 98 LEDs in the bag. There was supposed to be 100, but there weren't as many as there were supposed to be. But in any case, I'm going to go and have dinner now, and then I'll come back and I'll finish this off. I just got to add a header for the power connector and some wire links and stuff like that. But once I've done that, I'll give it a test and we can see if it actually works. So hopefully that will increase anyone's confidence if they're looking at mucking around with surface mount stuff. And yeah, it's just it's not as bad as it seems at first glance. Maybe you need some magnifying equipment if you have less than optimal eyesight, I suppose. But aside from that, the actual tools required to do the soldering are not really any different to through-hole stuff. It's just, yeah, it just requires, I suppose, just a bit of extra patience and just being careful. But it's not very hard at all, really, if you have enough flux and you don't use too much solder. There we go. That's what I've found. So hope that video was useful, and see you next time.